Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for spending some time today thinking with me about digital accessibility and inclusive design, which is something I spend a lot of time talking about and working on. Just a few logistical notes for accessibility reasons. I'll read out the social media handles on the slide. If you want to engage on Twitter, it's at Sina Bahram, so at SINABAHRAM. And you'll see this hashtag A11Y. It stands for accessibility. It's a numeronym. So the 11 stands for the number of letters you've taken out of the word. This is a great hashtag to use on things like Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, because it's a great tribe of people out there that are interested in accessibility and are just willing to help. And it's a lovely way to connect. A brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. In addition to some background information, we'll go over some definitions. I think it's really important to just be on the same page about what we're talking about, what we mean when we say certain things like accessibility and disability and things of this nature. We'll turn our attention a little bit over to digital accessibility specifically and what that means, websites, apps, that sort of thing. The accessibility of remote conferences, much like this one, what are some of the implications there that we should be thinking about? The role of technology, right? It can be both good and bad, and as an amplifier, what does that mean? And then the implications of the pandemic, of course, of COVID-19 and just the world we all find ourselves in these days, right? And also, what are the accessibility implications therein? And lastly, we'll wrap up with some tips and tricks. So really brief, I think the introduction pretty much covered it, so I won't spend too much time on background about myself. I happen to be blind, so I use a screen reader. For example, as I'm presenting these slides to you right now, I have some headphones on and a screen reading program is reading to me what the contents of the slide is. My background happens to be in computer science, so undergraduate and graduate degrees are in that space. I'm ABD and a PhD in human-computer interaction. And I'm really passionate about the intersection between how we can use technology not only to make digital experiences more accessible, but also the real world and the physical world more accessible. I feel like there's a lot of potential there. So what is accessibility? I've been tossing this word around. What does it mean? It's the ability of all people to use a product, a service offering, a place, regardless or independent of disability. This is important, right? That the accessibility definition refers to disability. So what do we mean when we say disability? Well, disability is the consequence of an impairment. This could be oral, this could be olfactory, tactile, dexterity related, cognitive, for example, emotional, mobility, visual, like myself, I mentioned I was blind, or a combination therein. And it's important to understand this because then we have different ways as a society of thinking about disability. Now, I will preface this slide. There is an entire field of critical disability studies. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this stuff, to research this very thoroughly. There's great literature out there on this topic. The two models I'm presenting right now are just by way of a contrast. They are by no means the only two models of disability, right? So the classic one, the somewhat outdated one, if you'll allow me that description, is the medical model. This is the way we sort of used to think about disability. And unfortunately, lots of organizations still think of it this way, which is that something is broken, something is wrong, so we need to fix that thing, right? So if you have a broken arm, you go to the doctor, the arm gets fixed or repaired, let's say with a sling, okay, or a cast, great. But what happens when you can't restore that functionality? What happens when you cannot restore the vision or the hearing or the ability to walk, right? So then what do we do as a society? We view that individual as disabled. Right? So we put the burden on them. Now, let's contrast this with the social model or environmental model of disability, right? Which realizes that it is the environment, not the individual, that is disabling, right? It is the environment that is disabling. It is the fact that, that you cannot open the doors because you're someone who uses crutches to enter the building and there's no door opener. The fact that that is a more difficult situation is not your fault for being someone who uses crutches, but the engineering and architectural and stakeholder decisions that were made that resulted in something like that, right? So now, if we accept this to be true, we should also consider something that is called othering. So othering is basically the act or consequence of making someone feel like they're part of the other, like they're essentially different. This can be both good, this can be arise both in unintentionally and intentionally. So intentionally, it's kind of like, discriminatory, where we separate people based on ability or gender or skin color or background, things of this nature, right? But unintentional othering happens all the time too. We might be trying to help and give somebody an assisted listening device, but if we don't think that full procedure through, and the fact that they're wearing a set of headphones now publicly identifies them as having a hearing impairment, which may not be their choice or their desire, we need to be aware of that, right? So that's a form of othering, even though it's in the context of wanting to do something good. So we should be very aware of this as we're designing solutions. So how do we deal with all of this? How do we prevent our environments from being disabling, right? How do we try to preclude this fact of othering from existing? And that is where inclusive design comes in. So inclusive design at its core is essentially a design process. It's not specific to technology, for example, or interfaces. It affects the physical world and everything that we do, content, policy, etc. And it simply realizes that people have their own specific ways of interacting with the things that we make, with the places that we work in. And that when we are designing these things, we need to be flexible and not put obstacles in for allowing users and visitors to change the way they interact with technology, the way they interact with our content, to make it better for them. You might have also heard of universal design, which is very similar to this concept, right? So why does this matter? Why are we talking about this stuff, right? Well, first of all, it's the right thing to do. If someone is unable to use our content or access the knowledge that we're trying to disseminate, this is incredibly important and a matter of justice. So I feel it is the right thing to do to make sure we're being good about accessibility and inclusion. It's the legal thing to do. It happens to be the law, not only in the United States, but in many countries around the world, right? According to WHO, there's about 1 out of 5 people have a disability. It's about 1.5 billion people in the world. This is not a small group of people. So even if you just look at this from the numbers, this is an incredibly intelligent thing to do from just addressing market, right? And lastly, over the age of 35, your chances of getting a disability or experiencing a disability are 1 out of 2. So that's 50%. This really affects everybody in some way, shape, or form, whether it's ourselves, whether it's somebody we know or love or work with. And so we need to be aware of these things. Briefly about PAC, I've got the website up here. I'll read that out, www.pac.bz, pac.bz. You can read about our projects and what we do there. But in short, anywhere where there's interaction between people and content or interfaces or websites or holograms, virtual reality, you name it, that's where we love to play. We love to get in there and change culture, and also work with engineering teams on really making things that people say, oh, well, that's a 40-inch touchscreen. No way that it can be accessible to someone who can't see. And we love to turn that on its head and just show that that's completely easy to do, and it's something that is going to pay rewards for years to come. Right? So what do I mean when I talk about digital accessibility? Well, it's the ability of all people to use your website, your app, and many other things, right? It's software on a desktop, for example, but with or without assistive technologies. So what I mean by this is, for example, I'm using a screen reader. There's other types of assistive technologies. There's screen enlargement programs that will zoom in on the screen, make text larger. There are programs that allow you to type with with your voice. So if you can't use the keyboard or mouse, you can control your computer system with your voice. There's all of these different forms of assistive technologies that people may be using on their own devices. And so we want to make sure that the digital things that we are creating are accessible in terms of interacting with those assistive technologies. Now, the way that we do that is we don't have to go specifically make our stuff compatible with, the JAWS screen reader on Windows or NVDA or the specific Zoom feature on Apple. That can come up during testing, of course, but it's really about following a set of guidelines. So what are those guidelines? Those guidelines on the web, and this actually a lot of them apply to apps as well, are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You'll hear people sometimes say WCAG for short, WCAG, and the version of those that is the latest is version 2.1. So when you see WCAG 2.1, and then there's levels, A, AA, AAA. AA is the one most folks conform with. That's what most laws are written against. So WCAG 2.1 AA is simply a set of criteria that let you know, look, when you have a button, it needs to have a label so that it can be read out. When you have an image, it needs to have alternative text so someone who can't see it is able to understand what that image is. It's rules like this that we can follow when creating digital content. Right? So how do we check this stuff? Well, there's both formal and informal ways of doing this. Using assistive technologies is a really key way of doing it. We need to test with these tools. Conforming with the standards is the first step, but then we need to go into testing, right? And the work that we do, for example, with clients, this is one of the major things we do when we're doing audits, when we're doing spot checks and things of that nature. All of the people on our auditing team, they are persons with disabilities. And that's really deeply important to me for a variety of reasons. But the most being that means that they have native expertise with these tools. So they know what to expect, which is what users will expect when using them, right? So testing with assistive technologies and native users of this AT is important. Using the tools and extensions that are built into the browser. So for example, Chrome has an accessibility audit that you can run from the dev tools for folks who are familiar with that. Firefox has an accessibility inspector. There are color contrast checkers, which let you know if you've got text on a background, is the text bright enough or dark enough compared to the background color so that it can be easily readable. There's these automated tools we can use in helping us assess accessibility. And what's important is to understand that those tools are great, they're wonderful. However, they only will catch about 20 to 25% of issues. This is why this last bullet says perform an accessibility audit or a WCAG audit, because that's when you can catch that other 75%. That's when the human testing comes into play and we go through those success criteria. So just something important to note, because there's a lot of companies that are selling automated solutions. Those are wonderful, but just keep in mind, they only can do about 20 to 25% of what we want from an accessibility perspective. Now, what are some accessibility considerations for remote conferences, right? So for example, like this one. Well, one is the accessibility of the platform. So I was really happy to hear we're using Zoom for this. For example, Zoom is pretty good about accessibility. They're not perfect, right? There are some issues, but it's compatible with a screen reader. It works on Mac and PC and mobile. It supports all these different modalities. So for example, video, screen share, audio, right? A text chat. So all of these different modalities can be used. That way you don't have to rely on just one in order to communicate. And this is really, really key. That flexibility is oftentimes how we achieve accessibility. Right? Some specific call outs, captioning support is really important, and sign language support. In the latest version of iOS 14, for example, the mobile operating system on Apple devices, one of the things for group FaceTime calls is if somebody is signing, they now will treat it as if somebody is talking, which is to say focus them in the frame and bring their square up in a group chat, which I thought was really, really key. That just that nod to understanding people communicate in a variety of ways, and we need to honor that, right? In terms of the accessibility of remote conferences, it's also important to understand the content that we are putting on these platforms, right? These PowerPoint slides, have pretty good color contrast. I've provided them to the conference organizers ahead of time. I've made sure if there's any images, they have alternative text inside of them. The reading order issues are figured out in PowerPoint. So that way that we know the content is accessible. Same goes for a Word or PDF handout or a website we might be using. So keeping in mind that it's not only about the platform, but the content that we have on it. Another form of content that we put on these platforms, of course, is the presentations themselves, right? So having presenter guidelines is really important. That means encouraging people to describe their images, or if there is a captioning or sign language provided to make sure to be compatible with that, because this way we are ensuring that the information we're conveying is accessible to everyone. From an organization and logistics point of view, if you're putting on a conference like this, asking about accommodations up front, right? And there's different ways of asking. I sometimes get this question, and it's not ill-meaning, right? But it sounds a little bit like that. It might be something, someone will see me with a cane, right? I travel with a cane. And so they're trying to help, right? And they'll ask, how blind are you? And it's like, that may not be the best approach to asking that question, but they're doing so because they want to know whether to hand me the Braille guide or not, right? And instead, a way of asking that is, how may I best help you? Would you benefit from the Braille guide? Would you prefer the low vision handout instead? Something like that, where you ask about ability, you don't ask about disability or about medical issues or something along those lines. I hope that makes sense. In terms of communication platforms, I thought we'd take a minute to just discuss a few of them. So Zoom, we've discussed, I think, already, right? In terms of it supports captioning, it supports sign language through video and screen share and these, screen reader compatibility, all of these things. With respect to Slack, this is a very popular chatting application, right? And it is improving in accessibility, but definitely has some issues, right? If you're blind and using a Mac, for example, you have to use it on the web. You can't use the desktop client just yet because there's some accessibility issues there. Slack doesn't support alternative text for images yet, so you cannot actually have images that are described, right? There's sometimes issues that come up with respect to using it with assistive technologies. Now, they're working on it and it's getting better, but these are things we need to be aware of, right? Microsoft Teams, for example, again, has reasonable accessibility support. Microsoft has been working on Teams accessibility for quite some time now, but it does still have some issues. It does still have some problems. So it's important to understand as much as you can about the audience and who's going to be using these platforms, and then to have workarounds, for example. Like, for example, on Zoom, sometimes breakout rooms are problematic if you're the host and a screen reader user and want to transfer between breakout rooms. But a soft tactic, if you will, a workaround could be that a co-host could migrate you over between rooms, right? So we don't have to not use Zoom, but we need to be aware of some of the difficulties that may come up. And lastly, social media, right? So we are on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook and all of these things. They all have differing support for assistive technologies and for accessibility. Twitter has visual descriptions for images. So you can type a text and you actually get more than the body of a tweet, 420 characters or so per image to describe your images. So I encourage you, as you're tweeting, as you're putting photos up on social media, please describe your images. It not only helps those who can't see, it helps search algorithms, it helps all sorts of things. And by the way, from an archival and collecting perspective, just from the museum's angle, when museums are collecting social media, it is so critical to not only collect discourse through the contents of the messages, but also to collect the accessibility information. So if you're collecting a bunch of tweets about a world event and you're not collecting the image descriptions, the visual descriptions that were there, that's not a full representation of that object. And not not only does it make your objects inaccessible if you present those tweets later on as part of a digital exhibit, for example, but it also can help future historians and archivists understand more context because of that visual description information. So I encourage you on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on platforms like this, describe your images, make sure the videos you're uploading are captioned, and so forth. This topic of remediation comes up when we talk about accessibility. And what I mean by that is simply that we have some things that have been built, they exist in the world. How do we fix them, right? How do we go about fixing them? We want to be tactical. We don't want to try to boil the ocean and do all the things and expect that it's going to be done overnight. We're going to have the content that is constantly updated. We're going to have new versus old content. It's important to be tactical about our approach to accessibility, right? If you have 10,000 unlabeled images, that's not going to get done overnight. But if you know that 500 of them are the most accessed on your website, those are the ones to concentrate on, right? Lastly, when we think about, well, actually two more points on here. One, when we think about tactics and policy, make sure they are in support of accessibility and inclusivity, right? So make sure that inclusion is embedded as a primary goal, not just a side project or a siloed priority. Right? And lastly, work with experts. There is a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of bespoke and custom knowledge around accessibility and inclusive design. Work with experts, but I'm going to caveat this, and this is something that comes up in my field all the time. I'm usually playing the role of this expert with various organizations. Work with experts that enable you to learn how to fish, not just who give you the answers, and then you need to call them again when something else comes up, right? You want to work with people who actually are conveying and doing knowledge transfer so that the entire organization can get better about inclusivity and accessibility and also innovate in that space. I've learned things from my clients just like they learn things from me, and I feel like that's really, really important to improving the state of the world. The role of technology, this technology to me has the amazing ability to level the playing field, right? The example I give to people, and this is really true, is that it's easier for me to, hack on code on a satellite that's in orbit than it is for me necessarily to find the trash can or recycling bin at Starbucks, right? And that's a true statement, right? And the reason for that is that technology is a great leveler, right? If you can have those digital platforms be accessible and that content be accessible, then you really can unlock potential for people who may not otherwise be able to have interacted with the world in a more meaningful way. So this is deeply important to me. On the other hand, technology is an amplifier. So it makes the good stuff wonderful and it can make the bad stuff terrible. So it is not the solution that solves everything, but instead should be thought of as this super powerful magnifying glass that we have. And if we are committed to accessibility and inclusivity, excuse me, then it can magnify those things. But if we are deficient in these things, or if we are not being very accessible, then it simply amplifies that, right? So speaking of amplifying that, what are the implications of COVID with respect to all of this? Well, if you think about it, we are living right now in an unprecedented time of remote access. We've got drinks with friends over Zoom and visual description tours over video conferences and conferences that are able to happen over remote platforms and all of these kinds of things. But what happens when we go back, right? For some people, it'll be wonderful because they can go back and physically go to the museum or the theater, etc. But for others, does that mean that this channel disappears? Does that mean that the accessibility that ironically came out of such a terrible event like the pandemic is actually going to get worse? So I just want us to think about preserving some of these remote approaches and channels, because I feel like they actually do have a wonderful upside for folks who may not physically be able to travel to our institutions and are benefiting from all of this remote access, right? To close out, I just want to, leave us with a couple of tips and tricks. So, the first one is in procurement practices, in sponsorship and things of that nature, make sure to include accessibility and inclusivity. If you're going to sponsor an event, if you're going to be putting one on, mandate this stuff as much as you can. Those have downstream effects that will just affect entire organizations to come. So this is a really big deal, especially when granting agencies do it, which they are now starting to do. The second one is raising awareness. If you're in a meeting, if you're working on a project, if you're on a conference like this one, please talk about accessibility and inclusive design with colleagues. It doesn't matter if you don't have all of the answers. Raising awareness about this stuff and thinking about it is so deeply critical. And I encourage you to please continue conversing about this topic. And lastly, build off of past successes, right? Celebrate the wins. This doesn't mean if you put on a show, for example, and you offer captioning for the first time, you send out a tweet and it's like, nailed accessibility, right? We did captioning, but it does mean, being proud of the fact that you did offer captioning, recognizing there's more we could do, like audio description, for example, or seating, for persons with disabilities or assistive technology devices, things of this nature. But there's always more than can be done, but I want you to, encourage yourself and your staff to celebrate these wins and engage with the community, because when you're doing this work, allyship is so very important. And by celebrating those wins, you're able to build those ties and then learn from the community of what you could do better next time, right? And lastly, I want to leave us with this quote. This is by Maya Angelou. It's my favorite quote, which says, people will forget what you did and people will forget what you said. People will never forget how you made them feel, right? And what I try to do in our work and what I hope to encourage you to do is to think about how we're making people feel with the content we're creating, with the interfaces that we're putting in front of them, because that's what really is going to be remembered years down the road. It's that experience, right? And with that, I want to thank you because, as somebody who benefits from this stuff, by considering this, you're also helping me. So just a personal note of thanks for spending time today thinking about this topic. I've got some contact information on the slide here. All of this is available in an accessible way on the website, so I won't read it out, but it's pac.bz, pac.bz. And if I can be of any assistance to you or just talk about accessibility with you, I am more than happy to do so. And thank you very much for having me today.